The world for Private Kenji Tanaka had shrunk to the searing heat of an Okinawan afternoon in late May of 1945. The coppery taste of his own blood and the volcanic landscape of what was once a simple sugarcane field. The air, thick with the sweet, cloying smell of death and cordite, was a physical weight on his chest. Every breath was a labor. For 2 days, he had lain in a shallow ditch, a piece of American shrapnel buried deep in his thigh. The wound, a riot of infection and agony. Above, the sky was a terrifying canvas, constantly streaked with the silver flashes of American planes, Grumman Hellcats and Vought Corsairs that seemed to own the very air he breathed. His superiors had spoken of the indomitable spirit of the Yamato race, of the Emperor's divine will. But here, in the mud and the blood, there was only the thunder of naval guns from a fleet so vast it blotted out the horizon, and the mechanical, inhuman chatter of machine gun fire that never seemed to cease. He had done his duty. He had fought until his squad was nothing but scattered remains, until his rifle was empty and his leg was shattered. Now, only one duty remained. His fingers, caked with drying mud and blood, fumbled for the Type 99 grenade still clipped to his belt. This was the final honor, the act of Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. To be taken prisoner was a stain on his family, his ancestors, his emperor. It was a fate worse than any death. The propaganda films that had played in his village cinema were seared into his memory, grinning, ape-like American devils with blood-stained bayonets, torturing captured Japanese soldiers, desecrating their bodies, laughing as they violated every code of honor he had ever known. His instructors had been explicit. The Americans were not human. They were beasts, motivated by a primitive bloodlust, and to fall into their hands was to invite a slow, agonizing, and deeply shameful end. He would die by his own hand, a final, defiant act against the monstrous invaders. As his fingers finally closed around the rough metal of the grenade, a new sound cut through the din of battle, the crunch of boots on gravel, heavy and deliberate. He froze. 2 figures blotted out the sun, their silhouettes impossibly large. They were giants, clad in drab-green uniforms and strange, bowl-shaped helmets. Oni Chiku, the demon beasts. He could see their faces now. They weren't snarling or monstrous. Their expressions were flat, weary, almost bored. One of them knelt, his rifle held loosely. The other, who had a red cross on his helmet and his armband, unslung a canvas bag. Kenji braced himself for the bayonet thrust, the final, brutal violation. He tried to pull the grenade's pin, but his hands were weak, trembling uncontrollably. The American medic simply looked at the mangled leg, then met Kenji's eyes. There was no hatred there. There was nothing. Just a professional calm that was more unnerving than any open hostility. The medic spoke in English, the words meaningless but the tone soft, strangely reassuring. He pulled out a pair of scissors and began to cut away Kenji's blood-soaked trouser leg. Kenji couldn't believe it. This was not the ritual of torture he had been promised. This was something else, something he had no framework to understand. The medic cleaned the wound with a meticulousness that was baffling, his movements efficient and practiced. Then, from a small case, he produced a syringe. This was it, Kenji thought. A poison to humiliate him, to make his death a spectacle. He closed his eyes, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt a sharp prick in his arm, and then a slow, spreading warmth that began to push back the searing fire in his leg. The pain, his constant companion for 48 hours, began to recede, replaced by a floating, dreamlike calm. He opened his eyes. The American medic was now applying a clean white bandage to the wound. The other soldier simply stood guard, chewing something methodically. They were not demons, they were men, and they were saving his life. For Kenji Tanaka, a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, this single, inexplicable act of mercy was more shocking than the firepower of the entire US Pacific Fleet. He had been prepared for brutality. He was completely, utterly unprepared for kindness. To understand Kenji's terror and his subsequent stunned disbelief, one must understand the world that had created him. The Japan of the 1930 seconds and 40 seconds was a nation in the grip of a fervent, militaristic ideology that permeated every facet of society. At its core was a re-engineered version of the ancient samurai code of Bushido. For the modern Japanese soldier, this meant an absolute fanatical devotion to the emperor, who was considered a living god. The highest virtue was not victory, but the willingness to die. Surrender was the ultimate dishonor, an act of spiritual treason. This belief was systematically drilled into every recruit. They were told that their bodies belonged to the emperor and that their highest purpose was to become a human bullet, sacrificing themselves for the glory of the empire. This doctrine found its ultimate expression in the policy of Gyokusai, meaning shattered jewel, a poetic term for annihilation in the name of honor. It was, in effect, a national policy of fighting to the last man, woman, and child. Soldiers were issued a last resort weapon, often a single grenade, with explicit instructions to kill themselves rather than be captured. On islands like Saipan, the consequences were horrific, as not only soldiers but entire civilian populations, terrified by propaganda, chose mass suicide over surrender, leaping from cliffs in a final, tragic act of loyalty. Japanese propaganda was relentless and brutally effective. It depicted the war not as a conflict of nations, but as a racial and spiritual crusade. Americans were portrayed as lazy, decadent, and materialistic, but also as barbaric, bloodthirsty demons. Posters showed hulking, monstrous GIs with fangs and claws, threatening Japanese women and children. Films and radio broadcasts warned that captured soldiers would be subjected to unimaginable tortures before a dishonorable execution. The message was clear and absolute. There is no life after surrender, only shame and agony. It was this meticulously constructed universe of fear and duty that made a Japanese soldier's decision to fight to the death not an act of madness, but of profound, and in their eyes, necessary honor. They never knew another reality was even possible. But on the other side of the churning Pacific, a completely different doctrine was taking shape, one born not of spiritual fanaticism, but of cold pragmatism and a deeply ingrained, almost industrial, sense of morality. The American military, while certainly capable of incredible ferocity in combat, operated under a set of principles that the Japanese High Command found literally unbelievable. The official policy, guided by the principles of the Geneva Convention, was to treat prisoners of war humanely. This wasn't merely an abstract moral stance, it was a calculated strategy. Firstly, a live prisoner was an invaluable source of intelligence. A captured Japanese soldier, once his initial shock and fear subsided, could provide crucial information about troop strength, fortifications, morale, and future plans. A single cooperative prisoner could save hundreds, if not thousands, of American lives. To the American command, killing a surrendering or wounded enemy soldier when he could be captured was not just immoral, it was strategically stupid. Secondly, the policy was a powerful tool of psychological warfare. American aircraft dropped millions of leaflets over Japanese-held territory. These leaflets often contained a simple, powerful message, a promise of good treatment, food, and medical care for those who surrendered. They showed photographs of smiling, healthy Japanese POWs in American camps, playing games and eating well. To the Japanese soldiers starving in their bunkers, beset by disease and constant bombardment, these leaflets were a seed of doubt planted in the barren soil of their fanatical resolve. For every soldier who surrendered because of these promises, that was one less soldier the Marines would have to face in a bloody, costly assault. But perhaps the most powerful and baffling element of the American approach was found in the individual ethos of its medics and Navy corpsmen. These men were trained with a single, overriding purpose: to preserve life. Their duty was not to the uniform of the man they were treating, but to the nature of his injury. The Hippocratic Oath was a code as deeply ingrained in them as Bushido was in the Japanese. They would risk their own lives under heavy fire to save a wounded American, and when the fighting subsided, they would apply that same training to a wounded enemy. It was their job. This wasn't a grand strategic decision made in Washington. It was the simple, daily reality of thousands of medics who saw a wounded man and did what they were trained to do. This fusion of strategic pragmatism and a deeply held professional morality created a reality that the Japanese propaganda had never accounted for. It was a weapon the Japanese military literally could not comprehend, and one they had no defense against. For Sergeant Matsuo Ishida of the IJA 14th Division, the world had been reduced to the suffocating humidity of a reinforced concrete pillbox on the island of Peleliu. The year was 1944, and the very air of the island felt cursed, a soupy mixture of heat, coral dust, and the stench of decay. From the narrow firing slit of his bunker, Matsuo had a commanding view of a stretch of white sand beach, now littered with the debris of the American landing. For 3 days, his machine gun crew had held this position, part of a complex, interlocking network of caves and bunkers designed by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa himself. It was a masterpiece of defensive warfare, and they were the masters of their small sector. They had watched the American Marines, the Kaitai, come ashore in waves, and they had cut them down. Their morale was high. Every dead American was a testament to their superior spirit and the sanctity of their island fortress. Through his binoculars, Matsuo often studied the enemy. They were big, clumsy, and loud. They seemed to possess an endless supply of everything: ammunition, food, cigarettes, even sweets. But they were also careless. They exposed themselves unnecessarily. They bunched up. They acted with an individualistic recklessness that Matsuo and his men found contemptible. Among the most curious sights were the ones they called the Akajuji, the Red Crosses. These were American soldiers, often Navy corpsmen attached to the Marines, who carried no rifles. Instead, they were burdened with heavy medical bags. At first, Matsuo and his men laughed at them. They couldn't believe the Americans would be so foolish. To send a man into the teeth of the Imperial Japanese army without a weapon was an act of supreme arrogance or supreme stupidity. It was further proof of the stories they'd been told. The Americans were a soft, decadent people who did not understand the true nature of war. War was about killing. It was about dying for the Emperor. It was not about bandaging. The sight of these unarmed men scurrying about became a running joke in the pillbox, a source of grim amusement as they waited for the next suicidal Marine assault. They were a symbol of everything the Japanese soldiers despised about their enemy. They laughed at them, until the day the laughter died in their throats. The assault began just after dawn, heralded by a naval bombardment that shook the very bedrock of the island. When it lifted, the Marines came, as they always did, leaning into the storm of fire. Matsuo's Nambu Type 92 heavy machine gun began its rhythmic, hammering work. The sand in front of the pillbox, already stained and churned, was ripped anew by the streams of 7.7mm rounds. An American squad, trying to flank their position, was caught in the open. One by one, they were hit. One Marine, a young man with a face barely old enough for a beard, was struck in the chest and fell just 30 yards from Matsuo's firing slit. He wasn't dead. He was screaming. It was a high, piercing sound that cut through the cacophony of the battle, a sound of pure agony. The rest of his squad was pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. Matsuo watched the wounded man, his finger resting on the trigger. In his mind, the American was already dead. The Japanese way was clear. A wounded soldier was a liability. He was to be left, or if possible, given a grenade to end his own suffering and take some of the enemy with him. The mission was everything. The individual was nothing. Matsuo expected the other Marines to fall back, to leave their comrade to his fate. He had seen it 100 times. But then, something happened that defied all logic, all training, all understanding of warfare. A figure broke from cover. It was one of the Akajuji. He had no rifle, only his medical bag. He began to run directly toward the screaming Marine, into the very heart of the kill zone Matsuo's gun commanded. The men in the pillbox were stunned into silence. The chatter of the Nambu ceased. Every eye was fixed on this single, insane act. Matsuo couldn't believe what he was seeing. Bullets from other positions kicked up plumes of coral sand around the corpsmen's feet. He didn't falter. He ran with a strange, loping gait, his head down, his focus absolute. It was not the ferocious, screaming charge of a banzai attacker. It was the dogged, determined movement of a man with a singular, incomprehensible purpose. He was not trying to kill them. He was trying to save one of his own, in a place where death was all but guaranteed. Matsuo's gunner, a corporal named Ito, had the corpsman dead in his sights. His hand was on the grip, his thumb on the trigger, but he didn't fire. He just stared, his mouth slightly agape. Matsuo didn't give the order. He was mesmerized, caught in a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. The corpsman reached the wounded Marine. He dropped to his knees, oblivious to the mortal danger he was in, and went to work. From their vantage point, the Japanese soldiers could see the frantic, yet precise, movements. They saw the flash of scissors cutting away the blood-soaked uniform. They saw the white of a battle dressing being pressed firmly onto the wound. They saw the corpsman pull a small vial and a syringe from his pack morphine to ease a dying man's pain. They were witnessing an act of such selfless, reckless compassion that it seemed to belong to another universe. Why would anyone do this? Why risk a valuable, living soldier for one who was already dead? This was a level of value placed on a single human life that the Japanese soldiers had never known, an idea their entire culture had trained them to reject. It was a spectacle more powerful and more shocking than any display of American firepower. The immediate aftermath was a silence that felt heavier and more profound than the preceding roar of battle. The corpsman, having stabilized the wounded man, began the slow, agonizing process of dragging him back towards the American lines. No one in Matsuo's pillbox fired a shot. They simply watched until he disappeared behind a blasted tree stump. Then they looked at each other. The mockery was gone. The certainty was gone. In their place was a deep, unsettling confusion. Corporal Ito slowly let his hands fall from the machine gun, a look of bewilderment on his face. "Sergeant," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Why did he do that?" Matsuo had no answer. He had been taught that the enemy was a beast, a selfish monster who fought for material gain. But he had just witnessed an act of sacrificial love. The propaganda posters, the rousing speeches from the officers, the entire edifice of their hatred and certainty began to crack. If a man would run through a storm of bullets for a fallen comrade, then the Oni-Chiku were not the demons they were told. They were something else entirely. And for Sergeant Matsuo Ishida, crouched in the dark, sweltering heat of his bunker, that realization was more terrifying than any number of Sherman tanks cresting the ridge. His world had been turned upside down, not by an explosion but by an act of mercy. The inexplicable act of mercy that Sergeant Matsuo Ishida witnessed on the coral sands of Peleliu and that Private Kenji Tanaka experienced in the mud of Okinawa was not an anomaly. It was not the random kindness of a few good men. To the utter astonishment of the Japanese Imperial High Command, these acts were merely the frontline expression of a vast, methodical, and deeply integrated system. The Americans had industrialized compassion. For a Japanese soldier, raised to believe that the individual was an insignificant cog in the divine machine of the state, the American system for processing and caring for enemy wounded was a concept so alien it bordered on the supernatural. They were stunned to learn that the lone corpsman who risked his life for a single wounded man was just the first link in an incredible logistical chain. A captured and wounded Japanese soldier was not thrown in a pit to die. A pipeline of healing that was as formidably efficient as the pipeline that supplied Sherman tanks and artillery shells to the front. It began on the battlefield itself. After a firefight, as the smoke cleared, U.S. Navy corpsmen and Army medics would move through the carnage, treating the American wounded first, but then, systematically, attending to the Japanese. Wounded Japanese soldiers, lying in wait with a grenade for the final, brutal act of torture, were instead met with the calm professionalism of a medic applying a sulfur pack and a clean, white battle dressing. This white bandage became the first symbol of a shattered reality. It was a mark not of shame, but of an impossible salvation. From there, they were carried on stretchers to battalion aid stations, makeshift facilities just behind the front lines where doctors performed triage and emergency procedures. Here, Amidst the chaos of incoming casualties, Japanese soldiers found themselves lying next to wounded Americans, receiving the same plasma drips, the same morphine, the same life-sustaining care. They never knew that a system of such shocking equality could even exist. If their wounds were severe, they were evacuated further, often to massive, fully equipped field hospitals, and from there to the most unbelievable spectacle of all, the hospital ship. Lieutenant Saburo Genda of the Imperial Japanese Navy awoke to a world of impossible whiteness. The last thing he remembered was the catastrophic explosion that had torn his destroyer in half off the coast of Leyte, the searing heat and the crushing dark of the water. Now, he was lying between sheets so clean they seemed to radiate their own light. A gentle, rhythmic humming vibrated through the floor. He tried to sit up, but a polite but firm hand pressed him back down. The hand belonged to a woman, an American woman. She was a nurse, dressed in a crisp white uniform, her face a picture of serene professionalism. Genda was on the USS Solace, a US Navy hospital ship, a floating cathedral of medicine that was, to his mind, a greater testament to American power than any battleship. He had been taught that American women were frivolous and weak, yet here they were, serving near the front lines with a calm courage that unnerved him. For days, Genda drifted in and out of consciousness, his burns and wounds treated with a diligence that he found deeply suspicious. He was waiting for the trick, the moment the kindness would curdle into the torture he knew was coming. But it never came. Instead, he was given food, real food, hot soup, soft bread, even fruit juice. He watched as American doctors and surgeons, some of the finest in their fields, worked for hours to save the leg of a Japanese artilleryman in the bed next to him. They performed complex skin grafts on a pilot who had been horribly burned. They were not treating them as enemies. They were treating them as patients. The sheer scale of the operation was what truly broke his spirit. The Solace was a city of healing, with over 700 beds, multiple state-of-the-art operating rooms, X-ray labs, and a pharmacy better stocked than the Central Military Hospital in Tokyo, and it was just one of dozens of such ships in the US Navy. The Japanese military, which struggled to provide its own troops with basic bandages and quinine, could never conceive of such a thing. Genda realized with a crushing certainty that they were not fighting a nation. They were fighting an industrial titan, for whom even the preservation of an enemy's life was a matter of systematic, overwhelming efficiency. The symbol of this power was no longer a bomb or a bullet, it was the steady drip of an intravenous bag, the clean slice of a surgeon's scalpel, and the quiet rustle of a nurse's starched white uniform. For those who recovered, the journey into the heart of the American Leviathan continued. Thousands of Japanese prisoners of war were transported across the vastness of the Pacific to the United States itself. For Corporal Hideo Takahashi, a conscript who had never been more than 50 miles from his small fishing village before the war, the experience was a complete psychological unraveling. After recovering from a shrapnel wound on Guam, he was herded onto a transport ship with hundreds of other POWs. They were stunned when they were not kept in a filthy, dark hold, but in bunks and given 3 meals a day. The journey itself was a lesson in American might. For weeks, the ship steamed across an ocean that seemed entirely owned by the US Navy. Unmolested, a casual display of sea power that was beyond anything Japan could have mustered even at the height of its power. They landed not in a desolate wasteland, but in the gleaming port of San Francisco, a city that showed no signs of the deprivations of war. Then came a train journey that lasted for days, a rumbling, hypnotic trip into the very soul of the country. Takahashi stared from the train window, his mind unable to process the scale of what he was seeing. The endless, geometric precision of Midwestern farms, stretching to the horizon in every direction, the colossal grain elevators that stood like cathedrals in the small towns, the sheer number of automobiles on the roads, the healthy, well-fed civilians who sometimes waved at the passing train, their faces showing curiosity, not hatred. The propaganda had spoken of a nation on the brink of collapse, starved and torn by internal dissent. The reality was a continent of unimaginable abundance, a placid, orderly, and impossibly wealthy society that was waging the most destructive war in human history as if it were a side project. He was taken to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, There were no torture chambers, no medical experiments. There was order, routine, and more food than he had ever seen in his life. The prisoners worked on local farms, were paid a small wage in scrip they could use at the camp canteen, and were allowed to practice sports and religion. The most powerful weapon the Americans deployed against Hideo Takahashi was not a flamethrower or a dive bomber. It was a slice of fresh baked bread and a glass of cold milk. It was the quiet, undeniable evidence of a civilization so powerful and so confident that it could afford to be humane to its most hated enemies. The recurring symbol of his captivity was the simple, potent image of a neatly stocked shelf in the camp canteen, filled with chocolate bars, soap, and cigarettes. A small, mundane display of an industrial and cultural force against which his own nation's fanatical, desperate spirit never stood a chance. In the hushed, wood-panelled offices of the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, a world away from the blood and coral dust of the Pacific Islands, the war was a matter of maps, logistics, and the unshakable certainty of Japanese spiritual supremacy. Reports from the front lines were filtered, sanitized, and interpreted through the rigid lens of Bushido ideology. Initial American victories were dismissed as temporary setbacks, the product of brute material force that would inevitably shatter against the pure, diamond-hard will of the Emperor's soldiers. But by late 1944, a new and deeply disturbing category of intelligence began to trickle in. Reports so bizarre and contrary to their entire worldview that the initial reaction was one of scornful disbelief. The information came from intercepted American radio broadcasts, from desperate final communications from besieged island garrisons, and, most shockingly, from the rare Japanese soldier who had been captured, escaped, and somehow returned to Japanese lines. The reports all told the same impossible story. The Americans were not systematically torturing and executing their prisoners. They were treating their wounds. They were feeding them. They were, in a word, being humane. The general staff was stunned. The first assumption was that this was a new, devilishly clever form of American propaganda. It had to be a trick. The tales of medical care were surely a prelude to horrific experiments. The promises of food were a lie to encourage surrender, after which the true demonic nature of the enemy would be revealed. It was the only explanation that fit their reality. An officer who dared to suggest the reports might be true was seen as naive, or worse, spiritually contaminated by enemy thinking. The entire Japanese war effort was predicated on the belief in their own moral and racial superiority and the enemy's barbarism. To accept the Americans' behavior at face value would be to admit that the very foundation of their national struggle was a lie. It was an idea so poisonous, so fundamentally destabilizing, that the High Command could not afford to entertain it. They laughed at the reports, dismissing them as a sign of American weakness and desperation. They couldn't believe an army would be so foolish as to waste precious resources like medicine, food, and manpower on a defeated enemy. But the evidence continued to mount, becoming an undeniable torrent. American psychological warfare units began dropping millions of leaflets, not with crude propaganda, but with simple, undeniable facts. They dropped surrender passes, printed in Japanese, promising safe conduct and treatment according to the Geneva Convention. More devastatingly, they dropped photographs. A picture of Japanese prisoners at a camp in Hawaii, playing baseball. A photograph of a group of smiling, healthy-looking POWs eating bowls of rice. A photo of a captured Japanese officer being treated by an American doctor. For the generals in Tokyo, these images were more potent and dangerous than a bombing raid. A bomb could destroy a factory. These photographs could destroy the will of an entire army. The realization dawned with a cold, creeping horror. This was not a trick. It was a policy, and they had no strategic or ideological counter for it. Their enemy was wielding a weapon they didn't know existed. The weapon of systematic, institutionalized mercy. Faced with this incomprehensible threat to the morale of their forces, the High Command did the only thing it could. They doubled down on the lie. Their response was swift and desperate. They issued new directives to all military propaganda units, ordering them to create and disseminate even more graphic and horrifying tales of American atrocities. They fabricated stories of prisoners being slowly dismembered, of captured soldiers being used for bayonet practice by grinning Marines. They produced films depicting American doctors as ghoulish butchers, injecting Japanese POWs with deadly diseases under the guise of medical care. The message was hammered home with fanatical intensity. Any perceived kindness is a trap. Do not listen. Do not look. Do not think. To be captured is to die in the most dishonorable and agonizing way imaginable. Trust your leaders, not your eyes. Alongside this propaganda offensive, they issued stricter, more draconian orders to commanders in the field. The concept of Gyokusai, once a noble, if extreme, expression of honor, was now official mandatory doctrine. Commanders of island garrisons were explicitly forbidden from surrendering under any circumstances. They were ordered to fight until the last man was dead. If defeat was inevitable, the entire garrison was expected to commit mass suicide, often in suicidal banzai charges designed to inflict a few more casualties before the end. The pressure on the individual soldier was magnified tenfold. Surrender wasn't just a personal dishonor. It was now an act of direct treason against the emperor himself. The military police, the Kempeitai, enforced this doctrine with brutal efficiency, executing any soldier who even spoke of surrender. They were attempting to build a psychological fortress around their armies, a wall of fear and fanaticism so thick that the truth could not penetrate it. But it was a fortress built on sand. The American strategy didn't need to breach the wall, it simply seeped underneath it, carried by a leaflet on the wind, or the testimony of a single saved life. The psychological impact on the frontline Japanese soldier was catastrophic. He was caught between two realities. In one hand, he held the orders from his superiors, the lurid propaganda, and the deeply ingrained training of a lifetime that screamed at him to die with honor. In the other hand, he might hold a leaflet showing a picture of his former comrades, alive and well in a place called Wisconsin. He would huddle in his bunker, starving, sick with dysentery or malaria, listening to the incessant American artillery and the promises of food and medical care being broadcast from loudspeakers just beyond his lines would sound less like a trick and more like an impossible dream. This cognitive dissonance was a form of mental torture, more effective than any physical abuse. It corroded the soldier's certainty, the very bedrock of his fighting spirit. For a man like Corporal Ito, Sergeant Matsuo's gunner on Peleliu, the image of the unarmed American corpsman running into a hail of bullets would be forever burned into his memory. How could he reconcile that image with the monstrous caricatures from the propaganda posters? The ultimate effect was a crushing spiritual defeat that preceded the physical one. The average Japanese soldier was being asked to die for a set of ideals that the enemy was disproving, not with words, but with actions. He was told he was spiritually superior, yet he saw his enemy display a form of selfless courage that his own doctrine forbade. He was told his cause was righteous, yet the enemy he was supposed to hate was showing him a mercy his own officers would never grant him. This created a profound sense of futility. The morale of the Imperial Japanese Army, once its greatest asset, began to hollow out from the inside. The soldiers were shocked, not just by the enemy's strength, but by their character. It was the crushing realization that they were not merely being outfought and outproduced. They were being out-humaned. The war was no longer a glorious crusade, but a grim, pointless march toward an inevitable and dishonorable end, stripped of the very meaning for which they were supposed to sacrifice everything. The simple, clean white bandage wrapped around the leg of a captured Japanese soldier on a forgotten Pacific island was more than just a piece of sterile gauze. It was the final, undeniable product of a system of power so vast, so deep, and so fundamentally different from Japan's that it guaranteed American victory long before the final bomb was ever dropped. The Japanese High Command, and indeed the world, was stunned by America's military might, the endless fleets of aircraft carriers, the legions of tanks, the atomic fire that consumed cities, but they had completely failed to understand the true nature of American power. It was not just the ability to create weapons of unprecedented destruction. It was the parallel ability to create systems of unprecedented preservation. The victory was not merely industrial, it was moral, and the two were inextricably linked. The penicillin that coursed through a wounded POW's veins was not brewed in a battlefield tent. It was the result of a massive, government-funded national effort, a miracle of mass production that saw pharmaceutical factories in the American Midwest churning out millions of doses. The blood plasma that saved countless lives, American and Japanese alike, was donated by ordinary citizens in church basements and town halls across a continent, processed, and then delivered by a logistical chain that spanned the globe. The hospital ship, a floating city of healing like the USS Solace, was built in the same shipyards that produced destroyers, a testament to a nation that could afford to dedicate immense industrial resources not just to killing the enemy, but to saving him. This was the macro theme, the grand truth that the Japanese leadership never knew until it was too late. America's democratic and capitalist society, which they had derided as soft and decadent, had produced not only a superior war machine but also a superior system of human value, an ideology that views the individual citizen as a resource to be protected, educated, and cared for, will inevitably triumph over an ideology that views him as mere ammunition to be expended. The American medic saving a Japanese soldier was the ultimate expression of a system that believed in the intrinsic worth of a human life, a concept that proved to be more powerful than the most fanatical devotion to an emperor. The ultimate demonstration of this victory came not in the fiery climax of a battle, but in the deafening silence that followed Japan's surrender in August 1945. For the 70 million inhabitants of the Japanese home islands, this was the moment they had been trained to fear above all others. Their cities were in ruins, their economy had ceased to exist, and the spectre of mass starvation was no longer a threat but a certainty. Their propaganda had, for years, painted a terrifying picture of what would happen when the American demons finally arrived on their sacred soil: mass slaughter, the enslavement of their men, the violation of their women. The people huddled in the ashes of their homes and waited for the end. They had been told to arm themselves with bamboo spears to meet the invaders on the beaches and die fighting. Now, the invaders were here. The first American planes landed at Atsugi Airfield, and General Douglas MacArthur stepped onto Japanese soil. The expected wave of brutality never came. The Japanese people couldn't believe what they saw. Instead of vengeful conquerors, they were met with the quiet, overwhelming efficiency of the American logistical machine, now repurposed for occupation and relief. The same ships that had once carried bombs and landing craft now arrived in Yokohama harbor, laden with gargantuan quantities of food, medicine, and engineering equipment. GIs, who the Japanese expected to be monsters, were instead seen directing traffic, handing out chocolate bars and chewing gum to stunned, wide-eyed children, and sharing their sea rations with starving families. The US Army's Public Health and Welfare Section swung into action, launching a massive, nationwide vaccination program to ward off epidemics of cholera and typhus. American engineers began the colossal task of rebuilding bridges, restoring power, and clearing rubble. For the average Japanese citizen, the shock was profound. They had been prepared for a brutal fight for survival against a barbaric foe. They were completely unprepared for a meticulously organized and fundamentally humane occupation. They were being conquered not by force of arms, but by an administrative and compassionate competence that was, in its own way, even more intimidating. This was the final verdict. An enemy that feeds and heals its vanquished foe is an enemy that is not just militarily superior, but operating on an entirely different civilizational plane. In the end, the story of the Second World War in the Pacific was a tale of two fundamentally opposed ideologies. One was the way of Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. It was an ideology that fetishized death, that saw beauty in annihilation, and that held the individual as nothing more than a disposable vessel for the will of the state. It was a philosophy that, when faced with overwhelming force, could offer its people nothing but an honorable death. The other way, the American way, was messier, less poetic, but infinitely more powerful. It was the philosophy of the production line, of the problem solver, of the pragmatist. It saw the individual not as a tool to be broken, but as a life to be saved, whether it was a GI from Ohio or an enemy soldier from Okinawa. It was an ideology that, even in the midst of the most brutal war in history, carried within it the seeds of reconstruction. The Japanese soldier was taught that his highest purpose was to die. The American corpsman was taught that his highest purpose was to make sure that as few people as possible did. Years later, in the gleaming, rebuilt city of Osaka, an old man named Kenji Tanaka would sometimes take his grandchildren to the park. He would watch them play, their laughter echoing in the peaceful afternoon, a sound he once thought he would never hear again. He would feel the old, faint ache in his thigh, a phantom of the wound that should have killed him, and he would remember the face of the young American medic who had knelt in the mud and the blood of Okinawa. That medic, a nameless giant from a land he couldn't imagine, hadn't just saved his life. He had revealed to him a truth that his entire world had been designed to hide, that the greatest strength is not the power to destroy, but the will to preserve. It was the final, stunning lesson from an enemy they never knew, a lesson that defeated an empire, but, in the end, rebuilt a nation.